Part 1: The Hybrid Workplace and the Evolution of Office Politics. The modern office no longer exists within four walls. The pandemic did not invent remote work, but it accelerated a revolution that was already quietly building momentum, a shift from physical presence to digital coexistence. In this new landscape, the workplace is no longer a single place. It's a constantly shifting network of screens, messages, video calls, and fleeting human moments scattered across time zones and contexts. The hybrid workplace emerged as a compromise between structure and flexibility, between the tangible world of the office and the invisible sphere of the cloud. When the first waves of hybrid work began, many believed this would finally end the subtle power games and unspoken hierarchies that define traditional corporate life. Without the office's closed doors and water-cooler gossip, surely politics would fade. Yet the opposite happened. Politics didn't vanish, it simply migrated. It became digitized, dispersed, and in some ways, even more complex. In the traditional office, power had geography. The corner office, the conference room, the after-hours drinks, all were physical sites where influence could be seen and felt. Visibility was literal. You could tell who mattered by who sat where, who lingered near decision-makers, whose laughter carried down the hallway. In hybrid work, those landmarks disappeared, but visibility remained just as powerful, only now it is abstract, measured in replies, reaction emojis, and presence indicators. Hybrid visibility has become a new currency of credibility. Being seen has never been more paradoxical. One can appear constantly active online and yet remain unnoticed. Another can say little but occupy strategic digital spaces and gain quiet influence. The hybrid worker's dilemma is one of signaling. Do I turn my camera on to prove I'm attentive? Do I message in the chat to demonstrate engagement? Am I visible enough to be remembered when promotions are discussed? The politics of presence have turned inward, into the small, daily calculations of perception management. Managers, too, find themselves caught between two imperfect realities. In the office, they could observe engagement intuitively, body language, energy, tone. In hybrid environments, those cues disappear, replaced by data points and guesswork. A muted microphone might mean reflection or disengagement. A late response might mean exhaustion, not disinterest. The new manager must learn to interpret digital silences and virtual gestures, to lead through inference rather than proximity. The skill once known as reading the room has evolved into reading the grid. The sociologist Erving Goffman once wrote that all social interaction is a kind of performance, with people managing impressions as actors on a stage. The hybrid office is that theory come alive, only the stage is fragmented, the audience invisible, and the cues asynchronous. Every Slack message, every Teams reply, every half-smile during a video call contributes to an unspoken narrative about competence, loyalty, and alignment. Hybrid politics thrives precisely because interpretation has become so unstable. People project meaning into gaps. When communication fragments, imagination fills the void. Someone left out of a spontaneous office chat might interpret it as exclusion, even if it was coincidence. Someone who speaks more confidently online might be viewed as overbearing, while the quiet contributor risks fading entirely. In this environment, perception often outruns reality, and the story of who we are at work becomes shaped less by what we do and more by how others read our digital shadow. This shift has intensified a subtle form of inequality, one rooted not in formal policy but in psychological visibility. The hybrid environment privileges those fluent in digital communication, those who can project warmth and competence through text and screen. It advantages the socially confident and disadvantages the introspective. It favors those in similar time zones, those who can attend in-person events, those whose domestic circumstances allow uninterrupted presence. Hybrid work, despite its promise of inclusivity, can easily reproduce the same hierarchies it sought to dissolve. Proximity bias is one of its most insidious effects. Studies from major consulting firms confirm that employees who spend more time physically present in the office are still more likely to be promoted or recognized, even when remote peers perform equally well. The old logic persists: what is visible must be valuable. Yet this logic is precisely what hybrid work challenges, and what many leaders have not yet learned to unlearn. The irony is that hybrid work was meant to introduce trust. Instead, it exposed how fragile trust actually is. Without daily contact, many organizations revert to measurement. Dashboards, activity trackers, and performance analytics promise objectivity but often breed anxiety. When trust is replaced by tracking, people perform for the system rather than for the mission. The workplace becomes a theater of metrics, where appearing busy matters as much as being effective. The first act of the hybrid revolution, then, is not technological but psychological. It reveals how deeply human work still is, how dependent on recognition, fairness, and connection. Office politics, stripped of its old architecture, did not disappear. It became subtler, distributed across countless micro-interactions. And while the stage has changed, the script remains familiar: ambition, perception, loyalty, and fear, playing out in pixels instead of hallways. Yet this transformation also brings an opportunity. Hybrid work can, if intentionally designed, make politics more visible, less personal, and more about systems than personalities. It forces leaders to articulate what they once implied, to codify fairness, to make recognition explicit, to define collaboration not as proximity but as contribution. The politics of the hybrid office, in other words, are not an unfortunate byproduct of modern work, they are a mirror reflecting the maturity of organizational culture itself. Part 2: The New Architecture of Communication, Bias, and Trust. The hybrid workplace is a test of communication, and communication has always been the hidden infrastructure of power. The shift from spontaneous encounters to structured messaging changed not only how people talk, but also how they think about one another. In the physical office, misunderstanding could be softened by tone or gesture. A raised eyebrow, a smile, or a casual reassurance could undo tension in seconds. But digital communication has no gestures. It captures words but not warmth. Every message is permanent, every silence amplified. The written word, once a tool of clarity, has become a site of interpretation. What one person writes as efficient, another reads as curt. A period can feel final, a delay can feel dismissive. Hybrid work transforms the simplest act of communication into an exercise in diplomacy. Those who master nuance, who write with empathy, who know when to call instead of text, gain influence. Those who misjudge tone, even once, can find themselves subtly excluded. In this sense, hybrid communication is political in the classical sense. It is about persuasion, alignment, and the careful management of impressions. There is also an asymmetry of access that quietly shapes modern organizations. The spontaneous conversation in a hallway, the small gesture after a meeting, the informal chat before a call begins, these are all moments where trust is built, where allies are made, where misunderstandings are cleared before they become crises. Remote workers miss these micro-interactions, and their absence accumulates. Over weeks and months, it produces a soft but measurable gap in belonging. In psychological terms, belonging is the foundation of motivation. When people feel peripheral, they withdraw their emotional investment. They stop volunteering ideas, they avoid risk, they default to compliance rather than creativity. Hybrid politics often start here, in the emotional economy of distance. Not all employees feel equally seen, and those who sense invisibility begin to interpret every decision through the lens of exclusion. The politics of hybrid work, then, are often born not from malice but from misalignment, the gap between what people intend and what others infer. Leaders in this environment must therefore become interpreters of emotion at a distance. The modern manager must listen not only to what is said, but to the silences between responses, the tone behind text, the patterns of engagement that data cannot fully explain. Emotional intelligence, long dismissed as soft skill, has become strategic infrastructure. It is the only reliable method of sustaining trust when proximity is gone. Trust, in fact, is the single most valuable resource in hybrid systems. It functions like oxygen, invisible, taken for granted, but instantly missed when absent. Organizations that fail to cultivate it suffocate under procedural complexity. When trust erodes, bureaucracy multiplies. People demand more rules, more approvals, more oversight, trying to replace confidence with control. But the paradox of trust is that it cannot be forced. It grows only in cultures of transparency and consistency. Hybrid leaders who understand this design trust into their operations. They establish predictable rhythms, weekly reflections, open access to information, clear decision logs, so that people understand how and why choices are made. Predictability reduces paranoia. In distributed teams, even small surprises can trigger political reactions. When decisions appear opaque, speculation rushes to fill the void. The best defense against politics is not suppression but sunlight. The hybrid revolution also forces a reckoning with bias. The new forms are subtler but equally corrosive. The classic halo effect, where confident communicators are assumed to be competent, thrives in video calls. The recency bias, where recent interactions weigh more heavily in memory, punishes those who work asynchronously or outside the central time zone. Even digital fluency itself becomes a bias. Those comfortable with collaborative tools appear faster, more agile, even when the substance of their work is the same. These biases persist because hybrid work disrupts the old cues of credibility. In the office, experience or seniority often communicated authority. Now, the signal comes from presence and responsiveness. The danger is that performance becomes a matter of performativity, being seen to engage, rather than engaging meaningfully. This phenomenon, productivity theater, is the new face of corporate politics. People perform busyness, over-communicate, or over-signal their availability to stay visible in the algorithmic gaze of management systems. The irony is painful. A model designed to empower flexibility has created a new form of self-surveillance. True leadership in this context demands moral courage. It requires resisting the seduction of metrics, acknowledging that not all valuable work is visible, and trusting outcomes over activity. It requires designing fairness not as equal treatment but as contextual equity, recognizing that people operate under different circumstances and enabling them to succeed within those realities. Fairness in hybrid work is not about identical experiences, it is about equal access to meaning and recognition. The most mature organizations are beginning to see this. They are replacing vague ideals of flexibility with deliberate architecture, core hours that overlap across regions, asynchronous rituals that include everyone, documentation that substitutes for memory, and digital spaces that replicate serendipity. They understand that culture cannot rely on proximity, it must be designed to survive distance. But the greatest test of hybrid leadership is moral consistency. When leaders act differently online and offline, when values shift between the digital and the physical, employees detect the dissonance instantly. Trust fractures. The hybrid era demands authenticity that travels across mediums. Leaders must learn to project credibility not through charisma but through clarity. In a space where everyone is watching and everything is recorded, inconsistency is not just a flaw, it's a liability. Beneath all of this runs a deeper truth. Hybrid work exposes how much corporate life has always depended on narrative. People don't just work for salaries, they work for stories, about progress, belonging, fairness, and impact. When those stories break, politics floods the vacuum. Hybrid leaders, therefore, are also storytellers. They weave coherence through fragmented experience, giving scattered teams a sense of shared purpose. Without that narrative, the digital office becomes a collection of isolated contributors connected by technology but divided by meaning. Hybrid work reveals that power is no longer held solely by hierarchy but by those who can create coherence. The ones who can interpret complexity into direction, who can translate emotion into empathy, who can make others feel included even through a screen, these are the new architects of culture. And in their hands, the nature of office politics itself is being rewritten. Part 3: Ethics, Power, and the Future of the Hybrid Human Organization. In every era of work, politics has been a mirror reflecting the structure of power. In the hybrid age, that mirror shows something new and unsettling: the decentralization of authority without the dissolution of control. The old hierarchies have softened but not disappeared, they have become networks rather than ladders, influence rather than title. The real shift is that power now flows through information: who has access, who interprets it, and who decides what becomes visible. This is why the ethical dimension of hybrid work has become impossible to ignore. When communication is mediated by technology, every tool embeds an ideology. Algorithms determine which messages are surfaced, which names appear first in search results, whose voices dominate the feed. Software design quietly influences social design. A platform's defaults can amplify or silence, connect or isolate, reward performance or loyalty. The politics of hybrid work, then, are not only human, they are coded. This reality demands new literacy from leaders. Digital ethics is no longer the concern of engineers, it is a leadership competency. To lead hybrid teams is to curate an information ecosystem, to decide which data to value and which signals to ignore. Every metric becomes a moral choice. Measuring output rather than trust, attendance rather than contribution, responsiveness rather than reflection, all of these decisions shape culture. They send messages about what matters. Hybrid ethics, at its core, is about transparency and consent. People will accept monitoring when it is explained, resist it when it is hidden. They will tolerate imperfection in systems but not hypocrisy in values. Leaders who acknowledge uncertainty and share reasoning build trust, those who obscure decisions in jargon or dashboards erode it. The hybrid workplace runs on the currency of credibility, and credibility grows only where leaders treat their teams as adults capable of context. As organizations mature in this new world, a quiet but profound redefinition of professionalism is underway. Professionalism used to mean composure under scrutiny, the suppression of emotion in favor of decorum. In the hybrid setting, it increasingly means authenticity under observation, the ability to remain genuine across both screens and spaces. Employees expect not flawless formality but coherent humanity. They want leaders who are digitally transparent and emotionally consistent. The blending of personal and professional spaces has made this even more apparent. When colleagues meet through cameras, they glimpse one another's domestic worlds, the background, the interruptions, the glimpses of real life. The boundaries once enforced by architecture have dissolved. For many, this has been liberating, for others, invasive. But what it has undoubtedly done is humanize the corporate experience. The people behind the roles are visible again, and that visibility challenges the culture of performative professionalism that once defined office life. In this sense, hybrid work has the potential to make organizations more ethical, not by policy, but by proximity to truth. It's harder to maintain facades when daily life seeps into meetings. It's harder to justify exclusion when collaboration depends on intentional inclusion. The ethics of the hybrid workplace are thus rooted not in compliance but in empathy, the slow, deliberate practice of recognizing humanity in one another, even through distance. Yet politics persists because people are human. The hybrid environment, for all its flexibility, does not erase ambition, competition, or insecurity. It simply redistributes them. The new politics revolve around access, to attention, to leadership, to narrative. Those who manage to build visibility without resentment, who elevate others without diminishing themselves, become stabilizers in a system prone to fragmentation. In hybrid work, influence belongs not to the loudest but to the most credible. Credibility, however, is fragile. It cannot be downloaded or delegated, it must be earned through alignment between word and action. The best hybrid leaders understand that culture is not declared, it is demonstrated. When they switch their cameras on, they show up not just as supervisors but as signals of trust. Their behavior becomes a template for others. In such environments, office politics begin to lose their toxic edge. Competition remains, but it becomes creative rather than corrosive. Disagreement remains, but it becomes generative rather than divisive. The next decade will test how far organizations can go in embedding fairness into hybrid systems. The physical office was a space of privilege, accessible to some and alienating to others. The digital workplace risks repeating that pattern if not carefully designed. Accessibility is not just about bandwidth or tools, it's about psychological safety, about creating cultures where people feel they can speak without consequence, contribute without translation, and belong without performance. Technology alone cannot solve this. The real innovation lies in leadership imagination. The hybrid future requires leaders who can bridge contradictions, structure and freedom, accountability and autonomy, data and trust. It demands those who can think architecturally about culture, who can design environments where politics become transparent rather than toxic, where power circulates rather than concentrates. One of the most profound shifts may come from how success itself is defined. In the pre-hybrid era, success was often measured by output, visibility, and proximity to authority. But in a distributed world, these metrics lose meaning. The most successful hybrid teams are those that operate with interdependence, where members succeed not in isolation but through mutual amplification. This is not idealism, it's efficiency. Collaboration thrives when competition is reframed as shared mastery rather than personal triumph. The paradox of hybrid work is that it reveals the limits of technology by making humanity indispensable. The more digital our interactions become, the more we crave authenticity, fairness, and empathy. The more efficient our systems grow, the more we need rituals of connection to remind us why we work together at all. The organizations that survive this transition will be those that understand that culture is not a byproduct, it is the operating system itself. Office politics will never vanish, because they are simply the human negotiation of power and belonging. But they can evolve. They can become less about manipulation and more about mutual understanding, less about secrecy and more about systems that make influence visible and accountable. The hybrid era, for all its confusion and growing pains, offers a chance to rewrite the social contract of work, to create institutions that are both flexible and fair, digital and humane. In the end, the success of this new world will not be measured by how seamlessly people move between home and office, but by how gracefully organizations move between control and trust. The future of work belongs not to those who master technology, but to those who master relationship. Politics will remain, but they will no longer define the workplace, instead, they will reflect its maturity. When power becomes transparent, when inclusion becomes intentional, and when trust becomes structural, the hybrid era will cease to be an experiment, it will become the new equilibrium of human collaboration. And perhaps, in that equilibrium, the office will not just be a place or a platform, but a shared state of understanding, one where politics, once a source of division, becomes a language for negotiation, empathy, and collective progress.